Rebecca Summary Part 2. Mrs. De Winter is thinking about how depressing the sea is and feeling very self-conscious. She becomes paranoid that anything she says is going to trigger Maxim. Mrs. De Winter visits the bishop's wife and many others, who try to convince her to have another one of Manderley's famous balls. Mrs. De Winter begins to become quite friendly with Frank. She upsets Frank by asking him questions about Rebecca's death and then goes on to tell him how insecure she is. Back at home, she has been hired a young maid named Clarice. Patrice has sent Mrs. De Winter a collection of art books for her wedding gift. While trying to position these books on the morning desks, Mrs. De Winter breaks a piece of china, which turns out to be a wedding present given to the late Rebecca. She worries that Mrs. Danvers will be angry, so she hides the broken pieces. Later, Mrs. Danvers accuses Robert of stealing or breaking it. But Mrs. De Winter confesses to Maxim, and Maxim tells her not to worry about it. But of course, Mrs. De Winter is still freaking out, so her and Maxim begin to fight. Maxim goes out of town, so Mrs. Winter goes by herself walking. She runs into Ben, who is afraid Mrs. De Winter will send him to an insane asylum. Upon returning home, there's a man in the window staring at her. After coming inside, she hears Mrs. Danvers trying to sneak this man out. Mrs. Danvers' friend, as she calls him, runs into Mrs. De Winter, and they have an uncomfortable exchange where the man is introduced as Jack Favell. Mrs. De Winter goes to the window in the west wing where the man was standing so she can try to figure out what he was up to. Apparently, Mrs. De Winter and the man were in Rebecca's old room. Everything in the room is set out how it was before she died. Mrs. Danvers catches Mrs. De Winter in the room. She grabs Mrs. De Winter's arms and begins to tell her about Rebecca's death. Mrs. Danvers was out the night Rebecca died, so she blames herself for her death, thinking that she could have stopped Rebecca from going sailing. She says that Maxim was not worried about Rebecca when she did not return, and yet he moved out of the West Ring after he died, seeming that he was very upset. Mrs. De Winter freaks out because of this and locks herself in the room, thinking that she's so sick that she's gonna die. The next day, Beatrice takes Mrs. De Winter to go meet Maxim's grandmother. The visit was going all right until the grandma starts freaking out and asking where Rebecca is and what the new Mrs. De Winter did with her. When she comes home, she hears Maxim yelling at Mrs. Danvers about Jack Favell. The next day, there's a surprise visit from many of Maxim's friends who pretty much demand that they have a ball. The decision is made and the preparations for the ball begin. Mrs. De Winter cannot think of a costume to wear, so Mrs. Danvers goes out of her way to suggest that Mrs. De Winter mimics a dress from an ancestor of Maxim. Mrs. De Winter likes the idea and goes for it. The big day comes when Mrs. De Winter comes down in her dress, everyone freaks out, and Maxim tells her to change. Beatrice comes up behind her and tells her that she was wearing the exact dress that the late Rebecca wore to the last ball. After this, Mrs. De Winter refuses to come down. After a long while, she does come down, and the party actually goes pretty well. That night, she waits for Maxim to come to bed, but he never does. After deciding that Maxim does not love her, she realizes that no one knows where Maxim is. She calls Frank and confesses that Maxim never came to bed. Mrs. De Winter goes to confront Mrs. Danvers about the dress, and they have a full-on argument, which ends in Mrs. Danvers telling Mrs. De Winter that no one wants her there, and she should jump out the window. Mrs. De Winter is about to jump out the window when a loud explosion shakes the house, and that's where we end.